It's almost hard to grasp that the latest main title in the Yakuza Like a Dragon franchise, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, has already been out for over a year. Undeniably the biggest and most ambitious title in the series to date, filled to the brim with content variety and combat improvements, but perhaps the most polarizing narrative the franchise has seen. As a fairly longtime fan of the series and someone who eagerly anticipated the game all the way up to release, I ended up having a pretty mixed reception to the game, greatly appreciating the innovation on the gameplay side of things, but left with a sour taste in my mouth due to the characters and story as a whole not hitting like I expected, and I don't seem to be alone in this thought. It seems the fan community still has it fresh in their minds with either a love it or hate it mentality, and with that honestly pretty fun looking Pirate Yakuza Majima game coming out here soon, I wanted to get back into the spirit of the series by sort of reflecting on my still conflicted thoughts on Infinite Wealth. I've sort of wrestled with why the game felt undercooked in many places, and while I was laying all my thoughts out, I honestly wasn't sure what this video was going to be. At first it was just going to be a video about the character of Ichiban, then it was this whole reflection on the game from the perspective of it being 1 year old, but the thing that kept coming up over and over again was that setup staring me right in the face. The dual protagonist setup that introduced the game when it was very first revealed seemed like the perfect catalyst by which to explain my grievances with the story, and ultimately why I think the choice to star both the new and old face of the franchise in top billing maybe held the game's narrative back from delivering something honestly satisfying for either of them. Now, before things get crazy, let me address some things right from the jump so we're on the same page. I'm personally of the opinion that all the Yakuza series games are great, and would even go so far to say that I would put them on a pedestal of what great games should aspire to be, with them always featuring incredibly fun, enriching gameplay as well as complex emotional stories with inspiring characters. Now, with how polarizing the game is, let's just say, it's a hard opinions game to rig, but you know, why not? I'll give it a shot. First of all, the video game, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, is an incredibly solid and high-quality game. When I went back to play the game again for the 1 year anniversary and for this video, all my criticisms with the story just sort of washed away while I cleaned up side content and cleared out the endgame dungeons. The combat in this game is somehow leagues above what was first introduced in the previous entry, Yakuza Like a Dragon, despite that game being one of my absolute favorite JRPGs and my 2020 game of the year. The side content in this game, immaculate. From new activities like the Animal Crossing-inspired Dondoko Island, the Crazy Taxi-inspired Crazy Delivery, Pokemon Battle-inspired Sujimon League, to the returning karaoke, there is so much to enjoy in this game outside of the combat and story. Yeah, at the end of the day, this is probably my least favorite Yakuza game overall, but a somewhat disappointing Yakuza game amounts to probably an 8 out of 10 for me compared to other games. I will preface by saying also that I especially value story and characters a lot in games, which maybe isn't for everybody, and that's totally fine. These games sometimes get a bad rap for their complicated and over-the-top stories being considered bad, and while I don't really agree with that on the whole, it explains some of the disconnect there has been between some fans who value completely different things in these games. That explanation is sort of part of my interest in making a video like this, because my hope is that this video might help you understand your own perspective on the game, validate you if you agree with some things, and if not, you may still walk away with a better understanding of why this game didn't 100% resonate with everyone. Personally, I do care a lot about the story and characters in these games. It's why Infinite Wealth left me so conflicted, and so we're diving into that aspect of the game head on. There's no shame here for being interested in story and wanting it to be satisfying. This won't be some just condescending 5 to 10 minute video, straw man countering all the naysayers and distracting with the already admitted awesome gameplay and other high quality aspects like presentation and music. Before we dive into the narrative on offer though, I do want to look a little bit about the way the game chooses to present its narrative first. Full spoilers, by the way, on everything in this game and the last game and several of the other games in the series via clips, so just only watch this if you have already played Infinite Wealth and you don't care about spoilers. Structure-wise, Infinite Wealth returns to a storytelling format not seen in the series for quite some time, joining a relatively small group of titles that revolve around the use of multiple leads to carry the narrative. While doing many of its own things that we'll get into soon, the closest comparison would no doubt be between it and longtime fan favorite entry, Yakuza 0. Yakuza 4, Yakuza Dead Souls, and Yakuza 5 all feature several protagonists but carry their stories out in an order not dissimilar to a relay, where each player character continues a small part of a larger narrative before passing the buck to someone else permanently until a usually group-focused finale. Yakuza 0 and some of Infinite Wealth make use of a back-and-forth system where the leads will partake in a small chunk of their story, after which they'll trade player focus with the other until a finale that stars them both. The key difference between Infinite Wealth and 0, though, is that Infinite Wealth only adopts the dual protagonist structure about halfway through. The game features 13 main chapters and a finale, but the first 7 are led by Ichiban Kasuga, who was established as the new series protagonist in the last main game, Yakuza Like a Dragon, or Yakuza 7 in Japan. The other protagonist, previous series lead from Yakuzas 1 to 6, Kazuma Kiryu, joins Ichiban's fairly personal narrative as not much more than an accessory, helping Ichiban when he's in a bind and providing basic support. It's not until chapters 8 of 14 that Kiryu splinters off from Ichiban's group of merry men, initially to remove himself from the story altogether, and begins leading every other chapter until the finale. Make no mistake though, the story Kiryu goes on to explore in his chapters is not at all played as disconnected from the story Ichiban is experiencing. If we were to compare Zero's version of this, think of its structure as two seemingly disconnected threads slowly moving together until late in the story they become intertwined into one larger plot. Infinite Wealth, on the other hand, starts off as one distinct thread, then about halfway through splits into two, but the two basically stay very close together, even touching again at some points all the way through to the end. This isn't to say anything definitive at this point about the quality of the story we'll be looking at, but I think the format does indicate we may not be in for a story that at the very least makes the most of its dual protagonist setup. With good writing though, I think anything is possible, so let's get straight to the meat of things and see exactly what this narrative is cooking. Now, how exactly should we tackle this breakdown? I've decided that rather than painstakingly recap the story chapter by chapter, front to back, I'm instead going to hone in on our two leads, Ichiban and Kiryu, going through just their main overarching narratives. This is the dual protagonist dilemma, not the 50 characters that largely contribute very little dilemma. Though, out loud, I suppose that could be compelling. You'd actually be surprised by just how little to none some characters both new and old contribute to the character drama in this game, and the narrative as a whole. Tomizawa? He becomes friends with Ichiban after realizing how kind he is. Yamai? For sure. Solid arc, but surprisingly self-contained. Almost all the party members from the last game, mostly background characters this time around. I'm not even going to talk about Chitose, as while she technically impacts the plot quite a bit, it doesn't amount to much when you think about it. Some of these characters have things to do, but it's typically arbitrary to the character arcs of our main characters, so we'll be leaving a lot of this stuff out for simplicity's sake. That's not even to mention how some characters and threads contribute so little that they feel like side stories you're forced to experience, and some threads go completely without resolution. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This decision has helped me narrow down the long, somewhat convoluted narrative to just a handful of talking points for each protagonist, and I think there's no better place to start than with the character our game opens with.
私、今回担当を務めます春日と申します。よろしくお願いいたします。
Ichiban Kasuga, Employment, Ebina, Eiji, and Embarrassment. Following his debut in the previous mainline entry in the series, Yakuza Like a Dragon, Ichiban takes center stage in the sequel, continuing his role as the new series protagonist. For now, at least. All things considered, I actually really like the introduction to the game, and it gives us a good place to start off our discussion since it will get us familiar with the setup and context for everything that will follow. As the title of this section implied, we join Ichiban a few years after the events of the first game, and he now has a job at Hello Work. After the major Yakuza organizations disbanded, Ichiban chose to continue the mission that his boss, and technically father, started, helping former Yakuza readjust back into normal society. Great idea. We get to see what is likely an average day for Ichiban as he helps an initially stubborn former Yakuza begin to take the steps to improve his life. We follow up with Adachi, one of the main characters from the previous game, to see that he has also returned to normal life and started a security business for himself. All seems to be looking up for the gang, when a full year after this, we'll talk about the time skip later, all three of them, including the guy Ichiban is helping, are cancelled by a VTuber after footage of them testing security systems is taken out of context to accuse them of returning to lives of crime.
そこで防犯セキュリティの欠陥を調べる。我が社の出番だ。もしも今日お前が万引きに失敗してれば、店のセキュリティは正常に機能してたってことだが、依頼された調査自体は一旦完了だが、実はさらなるビジネスチャンスはこの先にある。待てよ、そうじゃねえ。
が一番が元極道に何か小声で指示しています。で、指示を受けたこの元極道がハローワークを出てどこに向かったかというと、コンビニ、ドラッグストア、ブランドショップとダミーの手まで用意して大量の万引きをしてるんです。春日がその商品を格安で買い取るっていう仕組みのようですね。つまり仕事のない元ヤクザに盗みを働かせ、その転売でかなりの利益を上げてるってことですね。
This scheme works somehow. Ichiban loses his job, Adachi loses all of his security contracts, and the former Yakuza indeed returns to organized crime. This is all in service of a larger plot to create conflict, but the execution here does come off as rather sloppy. The whole running VTuber thing is something that has had mixed reception in the community, but as an idea, I don't think it's beyond what the series usually sets out to provide commentary for. Influencers and internet trends are frequently satirized in these games, but I think the issue with the VTuber here is sort of how unbelievable it all is. Ichiban and company should have easy means to clear their names, but because they have no platform to do so, they are quickly forced to give up. The VTuber, on the other hand, is stated to average around 3 million viewers, which sounds like a lot, but it's far from the whole world like how they act in the game. A video could get 5 times that many views, but the likelihood that someone you just ran into on the street would have also seen it is still incredibly low, but here Ichiban is overnight an outcast to everyone at work and random kids on the street recognize him as a criminal. Adachi's situation is even weirder though, because the footage brought against him is literally of a service he provides, testing company security systems. Wouldn't everyone he's currently working with immediately know that the video is of a legitimate service that he has provided them and has likely discussed at great length? I guess not, because he's put out of business overnight as well and shuts down shop. Some might argue that this is just how getting cancelled works, and it's always a bunch of lies, but canceling really only works for big-name celebrities and well-known personalities. A small-time startup business and a guy whose 15 seconds of fame was running a joke political campaign years ago that got basically no votes is hardly breaking headline news. Like I mentioned though, this is all part of a larger scheme to get Ichiban susceptible to manipulation, so let's dive straight into our second topic, the one dishing it out.
はじめまして、春日一番さん。
This naturally brings us to our first major point of focus, Ebina, more specifically the game's main antagonist, Masataka Ebina. After Ichiban and his friends are cancelled, and they're planning to wander the streets aimlessly as vigilante homeless, they are approached by minor antagonists from the last game turned, I guess, neutral party, Joe Sawashiro, who is now working alongside this new guy, Ebina, to supposedly dissolve more Yakuza organizations. The two of them task Ichiban with heading to Hawaii of all places simply to meet his birth mother, who he only recently discovered was such at the end of the last game when he also discovered that his Yakuza boss, Masumi Arakawa, was his long-lost birth father. This comes off as a fun way to get Ichiban somewhere fresh and quickly away from his own personal problems for the time being, but perhaps to the game's detriment a little, as aside from a very brief moment in the game's final hours, Ichiban will spend the rest of the title there. This puts our protagonist away from his main setting, where he's considered the hero and defender of, and more importantly, away from the main antagonist. This scene where Ichiban is given the task to meet his mother is the only scene he shares with the main antagonist for the whole game, and as you may have guessed by me revealing now that Ebina is the big bad, that there is some serious manipulation going on here. It turns out that Ichiban's mother, Akane, is currently in hiding with a little girl, who are now both being hunted by every criminal organization in Hawaii, so naturally Ebina has sent the clueless Ichiban there in the hopes that he can flush her out and ultimately lead to their capture. Ichiban does learn about Akane's overall situation fairly quickly once he arrives in Hawaii, but doesn't question the coincidence of his arrival enough to stop himself from essentially getting her kidnapped the second he finds her, and by not one, but two of his own associates betraying him, but we'll talk about that later too. Back on the subject of Ebina, everything else to do with him is discovered and dealt with by the other protagonist in the game, returning series protagonist Kazuma Kiryu. It's him that ends up learning all the backstory and motivation concerning Ebina, and it's honestly quite interesting. Ebina is revealed to actually be another son of Masumi Arakawa, who you may remember is Ichiban's birth father and the person he looks up to most. It turns out that while Arakawa was in love with Akane and lamenting how to go about breaking it to his Yakuza boss at the time that he wanted to spend his life with her, he was also sleeping with the boss's daughter, and at the end of the day knocks them both up at roughly the same time. That makes our main protagonist Ichiban and our main antagonist Ebina, the child Arakawa had with the boss's daughter, half-brothers, or maybe more accurately, project twins. The ages do line up. The whole story regarding Arakawa and Akane being hunted down and separated is played completely straight in both the previous game and the start of this one, but of course this added context kinda throws all those tear-jerking moments right in the trash. Same kind of goes for all those scenes where Arakawa earnestly cares about the son that he did raise, Masato, since he apparently had another kid out there who he didn't care about at all who grew up to despise him because of it. Now, there's some speculation that maybe he had no idea that he had another son out there, but he was sleeping with the boss's daughter. So, I mean, maybe he could have done some due diligence and checked out see what was up with her after he killed everybody, which we see at the start of this game. Just a thought. Ebina, though, essentially acts as a foil to Ichiban as he wants to get revenge on all former Yakuza for how he and his mother were abandoned by Arakawa, a legendary Yakuza figure. This is, of course, the exact opposite of Ichiban, who idolizes Arakawa and wants to continue his noble mission to rehabilitate all Yakuza so they can go back to normal lives. Them being both brothers with opposite ideologies and clear daddy issues is really just the icing on the cake for this relationship/rivalry, and you'd be forgiven for expecting, nay anticipating, an epic showdown between them. But as I mentioned before, they shared their only scene right at the start of the game with none of this context revealed yet. No, it's Kiryu that ends up being the one to learn all this juicy drama, and while he shares this with Ichiban near the end of the game, Ichiban's reaction to this information is quite surprising. I'll let the game speak for itself and play every single line Ichiban has in the game regarding Ebina being his brother, and Arakawa essentially creating the mess that they're in now.
俺とエビナが兄弟
Are you serious? Was that it? Was that the only scene? Kiryu tells Ichiban all this information off-screen, and we fade in from black to the only line Ichiban gives as a response, leading to Kiryu waxing poetic uninterrupted until the topic changes. This might as well be a shrug of indifference. This strikes me as completely out of character for Ichiban. For starters, he finds out about this other side of his idol that has now led to their overarching conflict, doesn't have any major reflection on it, no opinion either way. Then you have Ebina. Ichiban finds out that he has this brother out there that experienced the complete opposite side of Arakawa and is hurting because of it. And after the climax of the last game was Ichiban emotionally breaking down at the loss of someone who he considered his brother and was also raised by Arakawa, this time he just doesn't care. There's all this setup for a full circle payoff for Ichiban's goals and ideals in this game, and an opportunity for Ichiban to redeem himself for his perceived shortcomings from his last game, but in the end it just fizzles out into nothing. The other protagonist, Kiryu, heads off to fight Ebina in the final chapter while Ichiban hoofs it back to Hawaii to topple a religious cult that he has almost nothing to do with. The whole finale honestly reads as missed opportunity after missed opportunity, starting first with Ichiban being completely mismatched as far as his final objective goes, and we haven't even touched upon the closure of the other arcs or the other protagonist. While Ebina and Ichiban had this insane family rivalry setup, albeit not super original, Ichiban instead carries out an emotional conclusion with another character entirely that we can touch upon now. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the character of Eiji, whose arc is missing quite a bit of setup but has an extreme over-the-top dramatic payoff, but as always I'm getting ahead of myself. The Eiji character gets introduced right away when Ichiban arrives in Hawaii. The two hit it off pretty quickly since Ichiban sees a lot of his brother figure from the last game, Masato, in Eiji on account of them both being physically disabled, and Eiji proves his worth by saving Ichiban from the cops when he's about to get framed by a scammer and by assisting him in a boss fight against a Yakuza that jumps them. The two do go their separate ways at the end of Chapter 2 though, and it's not until 10 plus hours of playtime later that he rejoins Ichiban right when he is closing in on his mom's location, partially into Chapter 7 I believe. Now, I don't want to downplay him too much. He's like a, look at me, I'm handicapped, but I'm good with computers type of character, but largely he sits in the background of scenes and does nothing in the hideout for much of this part of the game. It's only after Ichiban pulls his mom out of hiding that it's revealed that Eiji is a double agent working for Ebina, calling the bad guys to jump them and steal the little girl, and now they have her location.
この人はね、一番外にいる仲間に連絡する気なんだよ。私はずっとこいつに脅されて逆らえずにいたの。
エイちゃん。
よかった。やっぱりうまくいってたんだ。どうやら海老名さんの言う通りだったな。それが何を意味するか前に忠告したはずなんだけど。
エイちゃん、お前。
What we learn about Eiji here and shortly thereafter is that he also hates Yakuza due to them framing him in the past, and so he joined up with Ebina to guide Ichiban towards their goal of exposing Akane. He even faked his disability via the use of drugs so that he could appeal to him to befriend Ichiban easier. Nothing about this dude's personality prior to this reveal ends up being legit. He ends up being a pretty deranged and sadistic guy, even bragging about killing the little girl when he attempts to kill Ichiban and his friends. When Ichiban finally catches up to him to hopefully find out where she is, he plays mind games with them a little bit while beating the little girl and some of the party members. Eiji does get away though, delivers the girl to the cult for execution, and aside from appearing on a TV monitor during a boss fight, this is his last major appearance in the game before the finale. Several more chapters of the game ensue without so much as a peep from him, and it isn't until after Ichiban and Kiryu have defeated their respective final bosses and saved the day that we see him again. After Eiji had been essentially absent from the game for a good while, the big emotional finale of the story before hitting credits is all about Ichiban and Eiji's relationship. It turns out that off-screen, Eiji was I guess found out by the public for the crimes he was attempting to commit with Ebina, and has not only been cancelled, but there are civilians and supposedly also Yakuza alike chilling outside his apartment waiting to kill him. This is kind of weird though, because in the grand scheme of the plot, he's a pretty minor player all things considered, and the civilians in the story are always portrayed as on board with the poor treatment of Yakuza, so I don't know how realistic it is for him to take such a public fall for everything, but I digress. Ichiban shows up to save him from the mob and help him turn himself into the police, though it's not really clear what crimes he committed in Japan, since everything he did was in Hawaii, and there's jurisdiction stuff, but okay, again I digress.
何よりも、おめえにちゃんと罪を償ってほしい。
お前はいつまで友達ごっこしてんだ。
ごっこじゃねえんだって。エイちゃん。
よかった。やっぱりうまくいってたんだ。
エイちゃん、何を返しちゃくれねえか。
まだエイちゃん呼びなんだ。さすがに無理ありませんそれ。あんたとの今までのやりとり全部芝居なんですよ。ただしこいつもセットでね。 ああ、ダメダメ動いちゃこいつは衝撃で起爆するからくりなんだ。じっとしてないと。さてと。
俺はエイちゃん、おめえのことをダチだと思ってる。
So here we are, the end of the road. The game essentially closes on this emotional journey the two have as Ichiban attempts to get him through the mob so he can turn himself in, and overall it just fell so flat for me and it seems many other players. We have on one side the fact that he hasn't really given the player any indication that he's redeemable at all, and this whole appearance change and situation for him has zero setup, on top of it not really making a ton of sense. Now, I think the real disconnect here is that Ichiban insists that Eiji has good in him that is worth saving, but that isn't made clear to the player at all, and Ichiban never explains exactly why he feels so strongly about this. I think for me at least, this is just another thing to add to our already long list of disconnects many players are likely to have between themselves and Ichiban by this point. The game makes almost no effort to showcase much quality in Eiji past him helping Ichiban out in that one Chapter 2 boss fight, and instead seems to go out of its way to make him unlikable. The game beats you over the head with the fact that every detail of Eiji's personality before the betrayal is a facade, and he takes great pleasure in announcing his double cross the first chance he gets. It doesn't help that we have a direct contrast in Chitose, who was also a spy but regrets it immediately and tries to stop Eiji's betrayal at least. Let's jump back to Eiji's backstory, as it's quite possibly the least sympathetic villain backstory ever told, at least in the sense that we're supposed to take it seriously. It's explained to Ichiban after Eiji's initial betrayal that Eiji used to be a journalist investigating the Yakuza, when supposedly the Yakuza he was looking into had a guy jump in front of his car for some reason. I say supposedly because the shadow government people explaining this to Ichiban claim that even they cannot validate whether or not the Yakuza were actually involved, so the game won't even commit to saying for sure if he was really even impacted by them at all. Either way, this whole thing impacted him because his reputation was ruined and he lost his job, but the game doesn't bother to go into detail on what exactly was controversial. What the game does explain, however, is that the accident was a hit and run.
人を引いたってのか。
ええ。ただし三田村はヤクザにはめられたと供述しています。
So what? Eiji left the scene after hitting someone? I don't think the Yakuza made him do that. My guess, if I could be so bold, is that it went down like this. Ba-bump, ba-bump. Ugh, the Yakuza. I don't have time to deal with this. And then he sped off. I mean, why would he leave? Is this even an accurate translation? We also learned that the guy he hit lived just fine, stated in court he had no connection to the Yakuza, and that Eiji simply received a fine. Most flaccid villain motivation ever. I'm not even sure why he had his reputation ruined. Was it because of the hit and run? Because if so, then it sounds like it was his fault. Now, in the context of the story, I recognize that seeing the good in people and believing in second chances are things that Ichiban is known to stand for, but in the case of Eiji, it just feels kind of arbitrary since we aren't given a lot of context on what Ichiban sees in him. Not to mention that the game wants to present this as its big bombastic final note, complete with emotional music and high production value, no doubt to tug at some heartstrings. Even if we're to assume that Ichiban just treats everyone this way, whether it's practical or realistic, then why doesn't Ichiban get down with the cult leader after their boss fight and offer to help him redeem himself in what would no doubt be an emotional and tear-jerking scene? I honestly just think that they wanted to have this big moment to end the game on with Ichiban and bring his helping people full circle, but they cut some setup scenes and left out some needed exposition, resulting in an ending to this massive title coming off as kind of hollow. That's not to say you can't get swept up in the production value of this ending and the song, so I'm sure just on vibes alone, the scene worked for some people, but at the end of the day, I myself couldn't just shake the questions and confusion. Now, one of the wildest strawman arguments I've seen levied against all Eiji Ichiban criticism, though, is to compare Eiji's betrayal to some very different betrayals from the previous game. I've seen it said that of course Ichiban forgives Eiji no issue, he did the exact same thing with Nanba and Masato, and it's like, those situations are like night and day. To recap Nanba, he briefly betrayed Ichiban and the party over halfway through the game because he was trying to save his brother from an evil organization that was either holding him hostage or maybe had already killed him. This comes after Nanba had been a party member for at least over 20 hours where he had helped Ichiban numerous times in situations that put his own life in danger and did not have any chance of furthering his goal. Of course, the storyline ends with Nanba confirming his friendship with Ichiban, admitting what he did was wrong, and at the end of the day no one was hurt or killed. Please, can we just compare this logically with Eiji, who pops in and out of the story only to take advantage of and to manipulate Ichiban, betrays the party for entirely selfish and deranged reasons, and is directly responsible for having multiple named characters killed, also never changes his mind or admits any wrongdoing. I also don't have any memory of Nanba kidnapping a child and sending them off to be killed. Feel free to correct me if I missed it. Masato makes a little more sense, who was the main antagonist of the last game and did get people killed and deported, but at least there Ichiban has a 20+ year relationship with him and views him as a brother, so at the very least the player can understand why Ichiban wants to redeem him. At the end of the day, when it comes to Eiji, I kinda just feel like many players probably felt that he had crossed too many lines and was unable to be redeemed, on top of him not having a traceable real relationship with Ichiban to justify things from an emotional standpoint. Additionally, I think it's pretty reductive to just say Ichiban is an emotional idiot, so it makes sense that he'll break down and attempt to redeem any old monster, when Ichiban didn't go out of his way to try to redeem characters like Kume and Makuchi from the previous game or the cult leader from this game, probably because they killed people without remorse and exhibited no redeeming qualities, and I'd say for sure that Eiji airs closer to their levels of despicable than to any of the more questionable characters that he's been compared to. From where I'm sitting, it seems like they had a few options with Eiji. Have him work to at least somewhat redeem himself on his own, or reel in his actions so he doesn't cross too many lines, but like several aspects of the game's narrative as a whole, he goes underwritten one way or another. It's no wonder really that a section of the game's fans felt more confused by the ending where he suddenly becomes the emotional focus out of nowhere. Another missed opportunity, like I said before. Forgive me for the fan fiction, but if I squint, I can see a game where Ebina and Eiji are combined into one really interesting and complete character, named Ebina, and that really working. Ebina brings the setup, a foil for Ichiban with close personal ties and power to enact a grand scheme, and Eiji brings the traitor in the group trope and a bombastic feels overload to cap everything off. As they are now, they both feel underutilized, making Ichiban feel out of place and disconnected to the heart and soul of his game, his big sequel adventure following becoming the new leading man in the last game. That was originally meant to flow into the discussion on our other protagonist, and now he ripped the game's focus a little bit from Ichiban in a few places, but after careful consideration I figured it'd be incomplete to conclude Ichiban's section without talking about his other overarching story, romantic embarrassment. Yeah, this game had time for a romance storyline too. Well, maybe time for is a bit misleading. To be clear, the very start and end of the game, and almost no time in between, spend some time on the romantic pairing of Ichiban and ally from the previous game, Sayako. When things are still looking good for Ichiban, and before the time skip we put a pin in earlier, we get a portion of the prologue dedicated to Ichiban asking Sayako out on a date because he's got a little crush on her. How cute. She says yes, and the player is brought along as an extremely unwilling third party as they partake in cliché hijinks on what ultimately amounts to much closer to a friend date. Just when you think you might be in the clear, Ichiban treats Sayako and the player, as I certainly didn't consent to it, to an out-of-place and embarrassing marriage proposal. This comes completely out of left field, no setup, and we're just as winded by the whole thing as Sayako is.
一番
あのよ、俺は元ヤクザだし、足洗った今も貧乏暮らしで毎日ピーピーしてる。バカで勉強なんてできた試しがねえし、体はとにかく丈夫な方だし、ギャンブルもまあやらねえとは言わねえが、たしなむ程度なもんだ。こんな大して取り柄のねえ俺だけどよ、サッタンのことは俺が命に変えても幸せにしてみせる。結婚してください。さっちゃん、女なのにすげえしっかりしてて弱いとこ見せねえけど、でも一緒になったらもうそんな苦労は俺がさせねえ。なんなら俺が稼いでみせるから家庭に入ってくれてもいい。掃除洗濯水理買い出し何でも手伝うぜ。そんでガキも一緒にいつか大家さんの墓前に報告するんだ。
Understandably, she shuffles off without much of a response, and man, this is hard to watch. If Ichiban was a little kid, this would be tough to endure, but no matter how charming Ichiban can be, no man in his mid-40s should be this socially inept. Sure, he spent 18 years of his adult life in prison, but I really don't think that's an excuse for this level of stupidity. This is another one of those disconnects I think most players will have with Ichiban, and being right at the start, it ends up being the first of many. Following this disaster, Sayako starts avoiding Ichiban, and we get that year time skip to show that a full year passes by while Sayako continues to freeze Ichiban out, effectively ghosting him. For many players, this is a 180 flip writing blunder in the other direction. Ichiban may have been a complete moron, but Sayako and him were still friends for years at this point, so to ghost him for such a significant time frame now turns fans' negative attention straight to her. Sayako obviously gets more hate since she's a woman and Ichiban is a precious baby boy that can do nothing wrong, but for me, both of them come off as unrealistic and over the top in their reactions. Now, when Ichiban gets cancelled and heads over Hawaii, this plot thread is forgotten until Kiryu takes charge of the story taking place in Japan. Sayako ends up re-entering the plot as an ally for him, and her and Ichiban don't reunite until the final hours of the game, when Ichiban is very briefly in Japan again before heading back to curb stomp the cult leader in Hawaii. Now, I really don't even want to talk about this, but Kiryu and Ichiban have a chat about romance where Ichiban laments his ghosting situation. Kiryu, being the awesome, upstanding guy he is, starts talking about his own history with such proposals and accidentally sparks new confidence in Ichiban, albeit in about the dumbest way possible.
じゃあプロポーズとかしたことあります？当然だ。マジっすか？
参考までに何て言ったか覚えてます？
ただ好きだったって言っただけだったな。
好きだった。
So now he thinks he has it all figured out. This is so dumb. Ichiban might as well have just stumbled upon the script, because the logic here makes no sense. Ichiban pretty clearly understood earlier in the game that his proposal was not lacking in theatrics, it was hindered by it. It was inappropriate and overwhelming. So how he gets the idea that he forgot to love bomb even more is beyond me. I say he must have stumbled upon the script though, because this ends up being exactly right. Apparently Saiko really did cut Ichiban off because when he was giving his very inappropriate marriage proposal on their friend date, he didn't say I love you, which I'll concede fair, I guess, in a vacuum. He should have said that, maybe even led with that, but amidst the absurdity of his whole proposal, I think the love factor was pretty heavily implied. Enough that the year-long ghosting was probably an overcorrection. We spend the whole game thinking that he went too far and crossed a boundary, but I guess the lesson was that he didn't go far enough, all things considered. He just needed to be even more overwhelming with his feelings, and things might have worked out completely differently. The thing I've learned is that the ladies love it when you love bomb them. Whatever, in a post-credit scene, Ichiban finally says it and seemingly wins Saiko over until the scene transitions into comedy as Ichiban goes too far and puts the declaration on matching shirts for them to wear, ending the game and the plotline on an uncommitted and unserious note, at least for now. I can see why this conclusion might have bothered some, as it really feels like sub-story humor bled into a main plot point that some might have been really invested in. Now for me at least, I'll say that after the double whammy of Ebina and Eiichi's weird conclusions, I was already numb by the time this wrapped up.
ダメだこれ。バカは死ななきゃ治らねえ。そうだな。まったくだ。
When looking back with hindsight, the character moments relating to Ichiban just didn't feel as fully fleshed out as they should be, and while there are some good ideas, they overall feel disappointing given how half-baked they all are. We'll talk about it more at the end, but I really think that Ichiban would have benefited big time by having a big sequel all to himself to continue the great start he got in the last game, and though we haven't discussed the other half of the protagonist coin, I definitely think that some extra time in the spotlight would have at least made room for the time these ideas needed. I didn't even mention what went down with Ichiban's mom, because at the end of the day it's just another plot point that surprisingly doesn't amount to much. Not to the same extent as Ebina, but sort of similar to that, Ichiban just isn't interested in that connection. Once he gives her Arakawa's ashes, he maintains that he doesn't view her as a mom and doesn't want that relationship from her, even though she does confirm to his face that she longed to reunite with him. She also just disappears from the story near the end, since the cult leader's plan could just go on without her, even though he treated it like it was really important. Given that, I decided to forget about her too for most of the recap as well. We'll just call it intentional. Contrary to the time we spent so far, I don't want to rant endlessly about it. For now though, we can just move on to what some might consider the real main protagonist of the game. Kazuma Kiryu, from captivity to cancer to Christ. Jesus, I wrote that? Kiryu's story is a lot more straightforward compared to Ichiban's, but this first part here requires us to go back a bit. See, to understand Kiryu's place in Infinite Wealth, we have to sort of explain how he ends up here in the first place. I mentioned it a couple of times now that Ichiban is supposed to be the new face of the series, with Kiryu seemingly retiring from the spotlight after Yakuza 6 marketed itself on being the finale to the Kiryu saga. Yet here he is once again with top billing, so what's up? Well, the answer to that question is likely a lot more meta and real-world financially driven than this video at least is willing to go into, so we'll stick to the facts of the story presented. To recap his now outdated conclusion, at the end of Yakuza 6, Kiryu faked his own death in the hopes that his departure from the world would squash any remaining motivation organized crime would have to threaten his loved ones, since they had often been used as bargaining chips to rope him into various activities. Kiryu was able to achieve this somewhat suddenly by cutting a deal with the shadow government organization, the Daidoji, in exchange for him keeping secrets that he learned during Yakuza 6 about controversial post-World War II Japanese military activities. I know. This really ends up being more of a means to an end, and in that end, we're left with Kiryu walking off into the sunset with a mix of tragedy and a mix of hope, I think. While that still doesn't quite get us to Infinite Wealth, we thankfully got a shorter tie-in game to bridge the gap between Yakuza 6 and Infinite Wealth, Like a Dragon Gaiden, The Man Who Erased His Name. The good news is that this one released just a few months prior to our game of focus, so let's quickly take a look and collect the context we desperately need. Now you may call me naive, but I figured Kiryu might, don some new threads and retire to a nice vacation spot for the rest of his days, as the ending leaves things open enough to speculate on what's next. But no, instead it turns out that the shadow government that faked Kiryu's death, again, the Daidoji, now hold him captive at one of their bases, only letting him out when they force him to do dirty jobs for them. Additionally, they also have a handful of guys on payroll that just wait outside Kiryu's orphanage in secret, threatening that if he ever disobeyed them or reveal his true identity to anyone, they'll storm the place and kill all the kids. This is about as depressing as it is confusing. To remind those in the way back, the faking his death thing to hide his identity was Kiryu's idea. Originally, the Daidoji just wanted to give him hush money and otherwise let him go back to business as usual, so it really doesn't make all that much sense for them to so harshly enforce this part of the agreement.
あんたもその一人で口封じの賄賂ってことか。
養護施設のことを気にかけているんだって。じゃあ金も必要だろう。私は情け深い人間でね、憔悴している人間に鞭は打たない。それを気持ちよく受け取って全ての秘密を守るという意志、それさえ示してくれればいいんだ。
断る。
Now, some might say that maybe now that they've done this for him, they can't risk it getting out that he's alive or it'll make them look bad. But in this game, the Daidoji send Kiryu on missions against his will that almost always result in him being identified immediately, so it's really hard to tell where their priorities lie on this one.
あの堂島の竜でもな、桐生一馬、東上会の元4代目会長。
何者だ。
お前まさか。
俺らはもうあんたの正体を知っております。やっぱり死んだっちゅうのは嘘やったんですな、キリュウさん。
Now, we won't harp on too much about this game's plot as a whole. The basic need to know about the status quo is that Kiryu just traded one threat to his loved ones for another, and the only thing he got out of it was torture and misery. It just kind of makes his sacrifice deal at the end of Yakuza 6 look moronic, when it already was a tough pill for many to swallow since it came almost out of nowhere. Regardless though, it's important to note that Kiryu takes his deal with the Daidoji extremely seriously, as he won't confirm his identity to anyone that recognizes him, even in cases where the Daidoji already know his cover is blown. This will come up later. Now, if we jump to the end of the game, we can see how this all ties into infinite wealth. After completing an especially lucrative mission for the Daidoji, Kiryu is given, and I'm quoting them here, a vacation with no time limits. He's told he can go anywhere in the world except for Kamurocho and Okinawa, since people there are more likely to recognize him, but otherwise he's off to do his own thing. This is a little more in line with something positive going his way for a change. We actually learned earlier in the game that if Kiryu could go anywhere, he'd like to go to Hawaii, so boom, we did it. We successfully connected the dots, and we can just move on to his story in infinite wealth. I just hope that the contradictions with Gaiden end with the minor connections to Yakuza 6. I mean, come on. This game is a direct and intentional lead into infinite wealth, so surely everything is airtight between them at least. Kiryu doesn't show up until the start of Chapter 3 in Infinite Wealth. Ichiban finds himself in conflict with the local police after a misunderstanding, and it's during his attempt to escape that Kiryu shows up and offers to lend him a hand. Kiryu decides to accompany Ichiban in locating his mom, in part because he realizes that she is his target for a mission he's currently working for the Daidoji. This is sort of confusing though, as Kiryu is supposed to be on that vacation with no time limit that we talked about earlier, and we'll soon come to find out that Kiryu's been doing several jobs between both games. This just leaves me so confused because already things aren't matching up, like at all. At the end of Gaiden, Kiryu's all like, I'm off to start my vacation, but then we get this incredibly low production value scene in Infinite Wealth where the same character that we just saw see him off is now asking him separately to go to Hawaii for a mission. So which is it? Did he go on vacation, or did he go for a mission?
最初の目的地はハワイですか。
いや、そいつは最後のお楽しみだ。
偽名の身分証、クレジットカードなど一式揃えておきました。どうぞお気をつけて。桐生さん。
またな。
早速ですが、仕事の話です。写真の人物の発見と身柄の確保をお願いします。パスポートは来週までに用意します。もちろん偽名ですが。
パスポート？
ええ。その人物はハワイにいるはずです。
Pretty dumb, but whatever. Back to the story though, Kiryu acts not much more than an accessory to Ichiban. The two were actually introduced briefly in Yakuza Like a Dragon, so the game doesn't spend any time establishing a relationship between them. We are simply to accept that they are friends now. However, the big bomb drop for Kiryu's character during this first half of the game is delivered near the end of Chapter 3, where he reveals to Ichiban and company that he has terminal cancer and that he only has a little bit of time left. This was actually revealed in the marketing for the game as well, so the gut punch of this information is sadly not something to have a big impact while playing the game, at least if you followed the pre-release. Personally though, I think this is a really interesting idea to explore with an unstoppable powerhouse like Kiryu, as it seemed like a way to end his character and story with something a little more grounded and unavoidable. There's no doubt it's got great emotional and tragic potential, while still being fairly realistic and maybe even relatable. Unfortunately, just about every aspect of the cancer storyline is contrived and dull pretty much right from the reveal. The reveal, of course, which everyone already knows from the trailers, is immediately made a farce of when Kiryu explains how he got cancer. Instead of just being dealt a bad hand or a result of his dangerous lifestyle, we get this ridiculous and unrelatable story about how Kiryu did some work for the Daidoji between Gaiden and now, instead of being on that vacation we talked about, working in a nuclear disposal facility. So get this, some random guy has a heart attack of all things while driving his forklift, resulting in him crashing into a bunch of the radioactive containers in what might be the slowest fatal crash of all time. Fatal for Kiryu, of course, as he steps in to help the guy, resulting in his containment suit being breached. Great. So now Kiryu has cancer that no one can relate to or take seriously, wrapped up in the nice bow of being another head-scratching contradiction from the tie-in game. Fantastic. Textbook example of less is more in my opinion, as no explanation at all would have been better than this. It's just so ridiculous. The game seems to know this as well, as after the story, Kiryu basically says, well, you know, really anything could have caused my cancer. But by that point, I think the damage is done. Ichiban asks Kiryu if he should go receive medical treatment, and Kiryu confirms that he already has and nothing will work for him at this point. Remember this for later. For the time being though, Kiryu just wants to help this final job as best he can. Now, as we discussed earlier, Ichiban's mom is protecting a little girl from being killed by a religious cult, and the one interesting thing from Kiryu's perspective is how he sees this as a reflection of his own history protecting his adoptive daughter Haruka from being hunted down for a similar birth circumstances related situation. This gives Kiryu a strong poetic through line with the main antagonist and storyline taking place in Hawaii, and a solid motivation to see the mission through to the end. Unfortunately, he never ends up interacting with the villain on the Hawaii side of things after it's been revealed who's pulling the strings. Yep, now while not as personal as the family ties that we discussed with Ichiban, Kiryu also has a pretty obvious setup in parallel with who would go on to be Ichiban's final boss, meaning they both got mismatched by the end. When it comes to his time in Hawaii, Kiryu acts as not much more than support for Ichiban otherwise, until of course Chapter 7 when Kiryu's cancer finally catches up with him and he gets sidelined back to Japan to keep himself from further harm. Like I mentioned before when we discussed structure, this is where Kiryu begins starring as the second protagonist proper, and the player begins swapping between him and Ichiban chapter to chapter. Kiryu starts hanging out with the leftover party members from the previous game and is convinced to begin working on a bucket list to give himself things to accomplish with his remaining time. Another minor reoccurring plot point starts here too, where everyone is trying to convince Kiryu to get additional medical help, which he refuses. It's kind of weird though, because we already got confirmation that Kiryu had medical attention and nothing could be done, but he pretty quickly stops mentioning that and instead acts more stubborn about it. It's around this point that we get introduced to Kiryu's big side activity, Lifelinks, where he is convinced by a former friend of his, Detective Makoto Date, that he should get closure on all of his friends despite the Daidoji's warnings that if he meets with anyone or goes to Kamurocho there will be massive consequences. Now Date is allowed to know Kiryu's true identity since he was there to witness the agreement in Yakuza 6 between Kiryu and the Daidoji, so that sort of checks out. But to go on a brief tangent for a minute, what doesn't check out is how Kiryu makes almost no effort to hide who he is to the main characters in this game. Despite not budging once in Gaiden, all of Ichiban's friends and new party members are introduced to him as Kiryu and call him that accordingly in almost every scene, with Kiryu himself making no attempt to use the fake name given to him at the end of Gaiden. The only time he does is when he runs into a former friend of his who is running the bar everyone hangs out at, despite the fact that in the immediate following scene everyone is calling him Kiryu right in front of the bartender. Whatever man, back to those lifelinks. So Date surmises that he can arrange these almost meetings where Date will meet with one of Kiryu's friends from past games while Kiryu hides in the corner or something and listens in. In some cases though, Kiryu does actually get up close and personal, and in some instances to the point of carrying a conversation. For example, with the Hirose family, they seem to just pretend not to recognize him in a sort of wink-wink nudge-nudge kind of way, whereas with Akiyama, the cat is out of the bag right away and they just hang out like nothing's up. It's only in the final lifelink where Kiryu decides to get really crazy and arrange a meeting with his adoptive daughter Haruka and her son Haruto that the Daidoji finally step in to put him in his place and remind him of the rules. Before this, the whole thing is such a far cry from how Kiryu and the Daidoji acted back in Gaiden that it all feels out of place. Another thing that feels disconnected regarding the Daidoji is the locations in this game. When the player gains access to Kiryu for the first time, the game pops up a little tutorial about how Kiryu can freely travel between the Yokohama and Kamurocho districts whenever he wants. Unassuming at first, though I actually thought the game had a typo or error when this popped up for the first time, because as established in Gaiden, going to Kamurocho is a big no-no. That's a one-way ticket to murdered family. Turns out the error though is that the game doesn't care about this little detail, so you can just taxi right on over with no fanfare or anything the moment you get this message. I mean, damn, putting the important plot hole to one side, you'd at least think Kiryu's first time back in Kamurocho after years of captivity would be some sort of, I don't know, grand moment, but I guess not. All these weird contradictions point to two things to me, really. Either that Gaiden game was made haphazardly without care, or Kiryu's inclusion in Infinite Wealth isn't all that well thought out. The whole cancer thing too, that sort of feels out of nowhere when you think about it, has surprisingly little impact on the main story other than when Kiryu gets kicked back to Japan, as after getting all the tutorials for the bucket list activities, Kiryu is once again pulled into an evil plot. Before we can see how that cancer and the Daidoji storylines wrap up though, we need to turn our attention to Kiryu's final role in the story and how it ties into our final theme for him, Christhood.
ヤクザって存在の罪、その全部を俺が引き受ける。
Since Kiryu isn't able to help out on the cult side of things, even though that does seem more fitting for his character, he decides to investigate Ebina, who we talked about previously in the Ichiban section. Kiryu's 3 chapters of focus all basically amount to learning what we talked about regarding Ebina's true intentions and motivation. Kiryu isn't 100% sure about Ebina, so he confronts him to see if he's up to no good, which results in his identity being blasted on the internet by the VTuber, proving that Ebina is in fact up to something shady. The Daidoji strangely have nothing to say about it, but we've got to let that go because we're going to be here all day if we keep nitpicking at that, especially since Kiryu immediately heads off to meet some of his old friends. Kiryu attempts to get help from his longtime friends Daigo, Majima, and Saejima since they're partially responsible for everything going on, since it was their idea back in the last game to disband their Yakuza organization and transition everyone back into society, which Ebina is now taking advantage of. However, shortly before this game started, they got cancelled by the VTuber too. Ain't that about a bitch? So because they all share a brain and can't be bothered to play a major role in this game, they decided it best to retreat to a rundown shack in the middle of nowhere to, I guess, wait for the cold to kill them. Now, I know we're focusing on Kiryu here, but wow, these 3 are so shameful and embarrassing this time around. Remember when Saejima and Majima used to be main characters, have independent agency, and have cool moments? Not anymore. Kiryu taunts them into a fight by calling out how lame they are, and I'm mixed on this fight. They turn the fan service up to 11 and all, but I think just how out of character they seem and how they still don't immediately regain their agency really soured the whole thing. It kinda just feels like an excuse to leave them out of the game up to this point and then have a hollow boss fight with them. Imagine falling for a taunt from your cancer-ridden longtime friend, and father figure in Daigo's case, and actually attempting to jump him despite knowing he's got like a few months to live max. This is a certified, really likable, and in-character moment. And yeah, they really try hard to make you think this is a cool, impactful fight by playing some semi-iconic music and throwing some PNGs on the arena, so it's fine if you fell for it, but if so, then I'm sorry to say that you did fall for it. With the information they received prior to the fight though, Kiryu now has his sights set on Ebina with a pretty good idea that his ties to Arakawa fuel his motivation. Now we talked about before how Ebina should really be Ichiban's problem, since they have more going on in their relationship both thematically and in universe, and Kiryu even knows about it. However, it's now that we get the reasoning for why Kiryu takes on this side of the ending. Before Kiryu and Ichiban have their romance chat, Kiryu explains that he wants to confront Ebina because he feels responsible for the situation. The dialogue is really vague in this scene, so at first it's not really clear why Kiryu feels this way.
エビナの人生を巻き戻せるわけじゃねえ。だが、このままあいつが道を外し続けて、二度と引き返せないところまで行っちまうのは、せめて止めてやりたい。それが、古いヤクザを生きちまった俺なりのけじめのつけ方だと思っている。
I genuinely do not know what he's talking about here, but this is about all the explanation we're going to get before actually going off and fighting him. Now, Kiryu goes to confront Ebina after Ichiban wraps up the cult plotline and exposes the truth of the big former Yakuza murder scheme. So when Kiryu and the group finally catch up, Ebina says that he knew his plan would fail all along and he'll just figure out a new way to punish all Yakuza. Keep in mind here that Ebina has an extremely personal grudge against one dead Yakuza and a handful of foot soldiers that left his mom out to die when their Yakuza family was disbanded about 50 years ago. Despite this, Ebina speaks like Yakuza are a race of people and generalizes their existence to fit his interpretation of the ones that caused him suffering in the past, on top of declaring that no atonement or good deeds can ever justify their adjustment back into society. He's clearly hurt and deranged because of it. However, Kiryu accepts his ideology and tells him that he can't argue with him.
お前の怒りを俺は否定できない。時代こそ違えど。
Says he has no right to criticize his stance or his reasoning.
俺にその権利はない。
And then Kiryu makes the bold declaration that because he was made chairman of a major Yakuza clan for exactly one day, against his will, 10 years after he was expelled from the Yakuza life, that he is partially responsible for this situation. Keep in mind that this was 20-some years after everything Ebina went through. Kiryu then goes on to say that the sins of all Yakuza are his to bear, and that he will take on every last one. This coming from a guy that wasn't passionate about any part of the Yakuza lifestyle beyond the noble samurai-type fantasy that could just deal justice outside the law, and was a guy who was not in the Yakuza and wanted nothing to do with the Yakuza since 1995. He essentially validates Ebina and goes so far to declare that he's willing to die for him if it means he could overcome his hatred, all on this false notion that Kiryu could have changed the Yakuza for the better. The Yakuza, huh? Ebina got abandoned by his dad and then his mom died like 10 to 20 years later because life is hard. Children of fast food employees have this exact same backstory. This isn't a Yakuza exclusive situation. Kiryu talks about how he needs to stop Ebina from going too far, like he hasn't already killed people, both directly and indirectly. What on earth is Kiryu talking about? Kiryu is in no way responsible for all Yakuza who ever walked the earth, and he certainly isn't Yakuza Jesus, but those are basically the words coming out of his mouth. Despite having a somewhat sympathetic backstory, Ebina is no less deserving of being put in his place than many other final bosses the series has seen before, but for whatever reason, Kiryu's approach is to coddle him.
あんたと同じ孤児だったんですよ。俺も生まれた時からたった一人だった。物心ついた時から貧困の限りを味わう毎日。そうです。人間はみんな嘘つきで身勝手だ。いくらたくさんの人間が周りにいても、みんないつか自分の都合で勝手に離れていく。お前は何にも分かってない。お前の周りから人が去っていく理由、俺にはよく分かるぜ。あんたが何を知ってるって言うんだ。お前から去っていった人間が今でも恨めしいか。ああ、あんな金をたかることしか頭のない血も涙もない連中、今ここにいたらぶっ殺してやりてえよ。だったら何なんだ。お前も同じだぜ。
俺の父親は昔ある代議士の秘書をやっててな、手柄は全部代議士に持っていかれ、挙句の果てにその代議士の汚職が原因で自殺に追い込まれた。結局周りの極道が最後にひれ伏すのは金じゃ買えねえ極道の看板だった。
あんたの父親を死なせた代議士とは違う。おめえはそうやって何でもかんでも計算づくか。男の看板ってのは自分で設計図引いて作るようなもんじゃねえ。後から勝手についてくるもんだ。てめえの看板が欲しいなら他人の血で書くんじゃねえ。
俺が謝るから。そんなんじゃ許されねえことは分かっちゃいるが、俺が謝るから。すまなかった。
After Kiryu pushes himself to the absolute extreme despite his cancer and despite that 7 other able-bodied people are present and not helping outside of gameplay, shame! Kiryu gets all over Ebina's sweaty topless body and cries, begging him to give the Yakuza a chance to atone for their crimes. It just feels so out of character and so out of place for Kiryu to be saying these things and being like super over-understanding about Ebina's sappy backstory. I mean, several other antagonists in the series have gotten no sympathy from Kiryu despite crying about their sad past. You know who I could see at the very least crying and breaking down with Ebina? Ichiban. He did it in the last game too with its vindictive and malicious antagonist that was also his brother and also had a challenging upbringing due to the Yakuza. Kiryu goes on and on here about how Ebina needs to live and continue to grow, as being dead wouldn't solve anything, which sort of seems like something Ichiban would say after how last time this happened his brother was just killed right in front of him before being able to accept what happened and move on. Are these Ichiban lines that Kiryu is saying? Funny enough, Ichiban does say incredibly similar lines to these when talking about his dead brother from the last game in the optional dialogue I mentioned earlier. Maybe I'm going a little too far in a crazy conspiracy direction, but like, why am I feeling it though? The way it is now, things just feel so out of left field for Kiryu, and the things he's saying seem so antithetical to his whole character up to this point. This unwarranted burden he's placing on himself for something he's not responsible for in the slightest, and taking accountability based on a position of power he didn't really ever hold. Then you have the insinuation that Ebina might have never thought the plan with the cult would have even worked, and that right before the boss fight it's revealed that he spared someone the group thought he killed, so maybe Ebina was supposed to be redeemed. However, Ebina never actually responds to anything Kiryu says before or after the fight, and this is his last scene. The game doesn't even so much as look in his direction during or after Kiryu's big crybaby speech, so it's hard to even say what we're supposed to take away from his character overall. Of course, everything on Kiryu's end ends up being rushed, by the way. On top of getting no words from Ebina after Kiryu's plea, the next thing we see is that Kiryu finally ended up going to the hospital for treatment, paying off that stubbornness from earlier, but again, conflicting with that time he said that he already sought help. I don't know. Then the game has the gall to end with Kiryu giving his name to the doctor as the super final moment in the whole game, even though the whole thing with the Daidoji, remember that, was almost completely cut out of the game, except for in a lifelink where they beat his ass and said that he was theirs forever. The PlayStation trophy for beating the game is The Man Who Regained His Name, and I'm just like, when? That part of the story was completely forgotten. Haruka also shows up at the end. I guess she found out that Kiryu was alive off screen. Great, that would have made for an interesting scene to show, I guess. I hope she doesn't just get murdered by the Daidoji when she sees him. That's what almost happened last time. But yeah, that's the game. Ichiban ends with a silly, romance, non-conclusive wrap-up scene, no doubt because the writers probably have no idea what to do with him there, and Kiryu ends up with a resolution to a plotline that wasn't really in the game. One aspect of these games that is universally praised but I think works against this particular game is how the titles in this series are typically set in their release year. This is a really cool thing the series does, but in an era where mainline big budget games and major franchises don't release but once every handful of years, I can't help but be even more disappointed because this really rushed ending won't get followed up on anytime soon, and when it does, it'll likely be after a big time skip. The start of this game actually suffers from that too, where the person who showed up randomly and killed the main antagonist from the last game is just stated in optional dialogue to have been arrested shortly after, probably because a thread like that wasn't as interesting to follow up on 4 or 5 years later. In this game, the years of 2020, 2021, and 2022 have to basically stagnate because of the trend to stay current, but I suppose that's a topic for another day, and who knows what the future of the series will look like at this point. Another issue with the ending I haven't seen much talk about is how the Yakuza series doesn't do a great job at bringing back villain characters in future entries. Some might counter the criticisms I placed on Ebina or Eiji because this could just be set up for the next main game where they are relevant again, but surviving antagonists at this time have never once appeared again in later mainline titles, like ever. I could certainly be proven wrong with the next game, anything's possible I suppose, but I won't be holding my breath. So what was the point of complaining about these various plots? I guess it goes without saying that I don't really think Kiryu or Ichiban had especially compelling stories when looked at in their totality. I don't think they are all necessarily bad ideas, but by the end, both characters seem to be in conflict over who should be doing what, and neither really has breathing room to reach satisfying conclusions. I think maybe this one would have benefited from just being about Ichiban. Again, it is his big sequel game after all, letting him deal with both the Japan and Hawaii sides of the story. Then maybe they could have saved the cancer and shadow government storylines for a game that actually had time to address them. This isn't even to mention other undercooked and rushed aspects of the game, like how Kiryu's party consists entirely of Ichiban's friends from his first game, and Kiryu spends his time not only fighting against a perfect foil and family member to Ichiban, but also Ichiban's former captain, who arguably plays an even larger role in this game than he did last time around. It just strikes me as so weird because it seemed like the previous game, Yakuza Like a Dragon, was pretty well received and acted as a good jumping in point for new fans, but right away they brought Kiryu back and now a good chunk of the game requires a ton of prior setup to be fully enjoyed. Kiryu's life links and the fan service scavenger hunt just aren't going to hit for those jumping in from the last game, and then the story they would connect with might leave them feeling shortchanged by all the Kiryu focus, especially in the second half. This is definitely the part of the video though where I want to encourage discussion about pretty much anything I've talked about so far. I may not have been satisfied with how it went down, but I'm interested to hear differently and maybe get a change of perspective. Like I said before, anything is possible. If you agreed with anything, I'd love to know that I'm not crazy, and if I am crazy, then I'm gonna need some help seeing why this is actually really solid character writing, and how I just missed the mark. I doubt many are going to want to hear me talk about this game anymore after trying to shred it for the last, however long this ended up being, but I wouldn't mind making some more smaller videos on some of the other characters, both positive and negative. Yamai was pretty cool, Chitose was a bit complicated, Saejima and Majima and Daigo were something, and Tomizawa was Did he contribute anything to the game other than just being an alright dude? Anywho, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and stay safe out there.